Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, What Plan Sponsors Need to Know, Providers and SOC Reports. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement, or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Kradjan, Partner in charge of Moss Adams Risk Advisory and Compliance Practice, and Erik, Daley, Managing Principal with Multnomah Group. And with that, I will turn it over to Erik to get us started.
Thanks, Emily. In today's presentation, we're going to try and cover a few things. First, thanks for attending. This is a relatively hardcore topic, so we know that those in attendance are the nerdiest of the nerds as it pertains to systems and organizational controls. But from a retirement plan perspective, we're going to talk a little bit about the Department of Labor and why this issue of system and organizational controls continues to gain acceleration as a concern for retirement plan sponsors and their fiduciary obligations. We're going to talk about the definition of what a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 are. And as plan sponsors and users of that data, what you should be looking for when reviewing SOC reports, and how you can get the necessary SOC reporting from the vendors that you work with. We're going to start. I'm going to hand it over to Emily for a polling question.
All right, our first polling question today. Which area are you most interested in during this webcast? And your options are A, learn more about SOC 1, SOC 2 reports. B, know how to review SOC reports from my providers. C, how to get information so I can undergo a SOC audit. Or D, I'm just here for the CPE. So I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. To participate in our polls today, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit Submit. And just a reminder to respond within this poll window here. We'll give everyone a couple more seconds. All right, and let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Erik, back to you.
Excellent. We're going to give you a lot of information about SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports. So I think we'll cover that. I know we'll cover the CPE and how to review those. So I hope that everyone will get out of this presentation exactly what it is they're looking for. As we talk about systems and organizational controls and the impact on planned fiduciary obligations, we certainly have seen that specific to cybersecurity risk or even just general operational risk relative to the plan, plan sponsors are spending more time reviewing the increased exposure to risk. There's been a tremendous amount of litigation from a class action perspective, an increase in activity from the Department of Labor relative audits, and certainly looking at these systems and organizational controls is critical to helping mitigate and address those fiduciary concerns. I think that many plan sponsors think that ultimately the obligation between provider and plan sponsor is addressed through contractual means, and it is. But I think, regrettably, what that typically means that there's limitations on how you as a plan sponsor can address any failures that may occur. And if those failures occur while there may be contractual obligations that pass through to the record-keeping provider, the fiduciary obligations still regrettably rest with the plan sponsor. So as part of any good fiduciary process, you need to manage the vendors that you've outsourced to and conduct pretty extensive due diligence. And I think that's where these SOC reports come into play. And with all the outsourcing that occurs, it's been a very, very long time since I've seen either a defined benefit or a defined contribution plan that's managed by an individual plan sponsor. Those are almost now exclusively outsourced to large financial services institutions. Understanding and mitigating, again, those risks becomes more and more important as part of your fiduciary process. So just to set the table before we get into the specifics of systems of organizational control, anytime you start a retirement plan, you have fiduciary obligations related to plan operations. Most plan sponsors, as I mentioned, retain service providers, record keepers, auditors, attorneys, consultants, investment providers to assist them in managing these operations. But the ultimate fiduciary accountability for any one of those outsourced providers still rests with the plan sponsor and the fiduciary committee that's managing that plan. And while there's lots of headline attention and ink dedicated to fiduciary obligations and breaches relative fees or relative investment performance, the most common fiduciary breach that's found by the Department of Labor has to do with plan operation. So did the plan get operated in accordance with the plan document as drafted? So ultimately, while you as a plan sponsor have the accountability, you've outsourced those obligations to a third-party provider. And as a result, like anything that you outsource, this obligation to monitor operations becomes critical. And the challenge, of course, becomes that you're trying to monitor the operations of a multi-billion, in many cases, multi-billion-dollar financial service organizations. How can you do that adequately? And as a large plan sponsor that may have hundreds to thousands of participants in your retirement plan, you're obviously not tracking every distribution, every plan enrollment, every investment change, every loan operation. These systems of organizational control become a critical component of how you go through that process. You are supported in most cases as a large plan sponsor subject to ERISA by an outside plan audit. Retirement plans that have more than 100 participants and are subject to the Employee Retirement Income Security Act are required to have their plans audited from a financial operations perspective. And a big portion of what auditors are looking for is, are there risks associated with the operation of the plan? They assess those risks. They review the internal controls, and internal controls is a two-faceted issue. You have both the internal controls of potentially your HRIS, payroll systems, other human resource and financial accounting systems, but also critically, the internal controls of the providers that you may have outsourced services to. Any good audit certainly has some audit testing, meaning they're looking at, over the course of the plan year, financial transactions that have gone through to make sure that they have been accounted for properly, and then evaluating those risks and audit results and reporting back up to both the retirement committee and, in many cases, back to the audit committee of the plan sponsor. So in reviewing these internal controls, plan sponsor is looking both, again, at your own organizational controls, as well as the organizational controls of the record-keeping provider that you may work with. And I think for at least the clients we work with, one of the mechanisms that we utilize to try and provide some oversight of that is a review of these SOC 1 reports provided by record keepers. I'm going to let Chris get into the details of how SOC 1 reports work and what's being tested and what potentially isn't being tested. But a SOC 1 report should provide you, especially as a financial expert, potentially within your organization, or even a retirement plan expert, some insights as to how the organization that you've outsourced to goes through the process of testing and ensuring that the data that they get is processed accurately and returned in a method that it should. This provides the auditor, this third-party auditor that's looking at your plan, also a review of those same internal controls. So while you should be looking at it from a fiduciary perspective, you also have the opportunity and possibility of reviewing how that impacts your record keeper's performance, and the auditor would be doing something similar. The second issue that does impact these systems of organizational control has to do with the most recent uptick in Department of Labor concerns about cybersecurity. The Department of Labor has issued what I'll call guidance for plan sponsors on cybersecurity risks. We've begun to see a significant increase in audit activity from the Department of Labor where they're questioning cybersecurity. And like the plan operations side, these cybersecurity questionnaires from the Department of Labor are touching on two things, both A, your own HRIS systems, and are you providing adequate security relative PII as part of your own HRIS systems? But then also, once you've hired this outsourced provider, have you reviewed their cybersecurity protections to ensure that once you've remitted data from a payroll feed from your organization to another, how does that play out, and is it protected by the provider that you've outsourced to? So one of the issues, again, that Chris will get into is the systems of organizational control relative cybersecurity risk that now have become equally important, in some cases perhaps even more important than the SOC 1s that people have been more traditionally looking at as part of a retirement plan operations review. So the DOL guidance is relatively extensive in this area. I think the questionnaire that I saw to a client the other day from the Department of Labor on cybersecurity had something in the neighborhood of 76 questions in it. But if you look at the guidance at a high level, it's got three aspects. One clearly is tips for hiring service providers. What should you be looking at? And again, I think part of that has to do with the review of systems of organizational control relative cybersecurity. Certainly cybersecurity best practices, what should be remitted, how do you handle PII, how do you avoid having too many folks with access to that types of data. And then the third ultimately is some of the tips for online security. And a lot of cybersecurity risk does come down to quality usage from participants and those administrators working within your organization. Certainly the headline risks relative cybersecurity, or some person or organization accessing data through an organization. The more common cybersecurity breach is a participant who hasn't enabled potentially some kind of secondary authentication in their account, and the prospect of these kind of dormant accounts, I'll call them, being breached by bad actors, maybe even bad actors that are somehow tangentially connected to the participant who's being targeted. So, Emily, I'm going to hand it back to you to get to our second poll question.
All right. Our second polling question today. Let me see. A little difficulty seeing this. Please bear with me while I pull this up on my screen. But if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's presentation, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. This is our second question. How often have you looked at SOC reports in the past? And your options are A, every year for my providers, B, just starting to review each year as part of my routine vendor diligence, or C, not something we've done to this point. So we'll give everyone just a few more seconds to respond. All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Erik, back to you.
Thanks, Emily. And I think the good news is that people have been moving in this direction. It doesn't surprise me. I think a lot of plan sponsors have not reviewed their very intensive reports. My hope is Chris is going to make these a little easier for you to digest as part of this process. So maybe next year, if we do a similar presentation, this 47 number gets to closer to 75. There's a lot of really good information here. And as part of this review, I think you'll find some value. Chris, I'm going to throw it over to you maybe to talk about the different types of systems of organizational control reports that are out there.
Appreciate that, Erik, and thanks, Emily, for your help. I'm glad to see the responses we're getting. I think that's going to flow very naturally into the presentation we've got coming up here. When we look at the ability to evaluate providers and consider their potential risks, as Erik alluded to, there's a variety of different areas we might want to get into, whether it's the contractual and transactional controls that are involved with that provider, the IT-related controls, the cyber threats, and the data protection that's around that, and just getting an overall pulse of what these obligations are being met. So we're going to start with some quick definitions. The first really centers around SOC 1, 2, and 3. And if you're not familiar with these, SOC 1 is traditionally what has been known as a SAS 70 or an SSA 16 audit in the past. And what we find with these reports is they're really centered around the transactional controls that are being administered by an organization. So this is where we're going to get into things like the plan setup and the contract loads and the adjudication and how all of the payments are being dispersed, reporting is being handled. A SOC 2 report, in comparison, really gets into the IT-related controls. So we're dealing with the security of the system, its availability, how transactions are being processed, confidentiality of records. And this really allows a much more intensive look at the IT-related controls in the system. And then we get into a SOC 3 report. What we're talking about here is a report centered around an executive summary of a SOC 2. So I would think if I was getting a report, I would traditionally ask for a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 report. That's where I'm going to focus my effort and interest in getting these type of reports in the market. So what do these look like? We'll go through a little bit of a definition to level set, and this is just more for background for everybody. The SOC 1 report is really designed for us as users of the report. So if I've got a provider or a third-party administrator out there, this is for me as a consumer of their services, or my own auditors would want to get a copy of this. And this is really where we are going to look at the financial transaction controls that are involved in the reporting. We're going to be really focused around how those providers are meeting our own contractual obligations they've set up with us. In the case of a SOC 2 or 3, it is related to the systems controls. And this could be anybody who's a consumer or user of the data. It could be myself as a contracted party with the provider. It could be my own auditors. It could be my internal audit department. It could be my own customers and how they might have an interest to know what's going on in their data protection methods. So again, this gets into the security, availability, confidentiality, processing, integrity, and privacy of the transactions. Each of those areas may or may not be in scope. Traditionally, you're looking to look at security and availability at a minimum. This helps you get a sense of how much coverage and alignment there is. We'll get into that more later in the discussion, but understanding what's in specific reports you've received, what's involved, helps make sure they're even applicable for us as an end user of the report. A little more comparison, if we look at it, the focus of a SOC 1, again, is the financial reporting. That's the historical context that's been developed. Frankly, the third-party administrators and providers have been one of the earliest adopters of these SOC reports, going back, multiple decades in its usage of the reports. And what's nice here is if I'm looking at what a provider does, I want to understand what are the nature of the transactions they're processing. Systematically going through and looking at the ways in which they're enumerating those controls through the life cycle of their administration on my behalf as a customer of theirs. looking at how reports are being prepared, and really making sure that they're reporting out to the market the full administration of their life cycle, what they're handling on my behalf. So the ways in which controls might be organized would typically follow the life cycle of the claims processing and the contractual setups that they've got going on. And what we tend to see is while there may be variability in the presentation, it's really designed to focus on the life cycle of the contracts that are being administered by that service organization, by that provider, and providing it out to us. In comparison to SOC 2, here, if I were to look at a copy of the report, they are going to give us an idea of what is the underlying system architecture that's being reported on, the software being used to administer that, the way in which those IT controls are being proceduralized or documented, who administers them, the underlying data. And then it gets into a very specific coverage of the nature of controls, whether they're change management, logical access, communication of expectations, backup recovery, insurance coverage, system monitoring controls. All of those are much more prescriptive in how they're defined within the scope of a report. It does make it much easier to compare and contrast. So kind of a piece I'd share with you is as our third-party administrator clients have done this, they've traditionally done a SOC 1 for years. And now that people are placing a lot heavier emphasis around PHI and PII protection, they're starting to ask for SOC 2 reports as well. So this is definitely a universe where there's a lot more activity being requested on the reporting side in order to meet vendor diligence out to the market. We're going to get into this a lot more detail, but this is a high-level comparison of what these reports would look like. If you look at the table of contents, you're going to see they all have an opinion. Us as an auditor would say, during this period of time or at this point in time, this scope of system meets its obligations or it does not. And if there's anything of issue, we're going to give you a highlight, a disclaimer in the opinion. Management says we attest that we're giving you all the information and it's a reliable environment. They give us a system description, which really then goes through and think about this. This is where they would tell you how they operate their business. So instead of you coming and interviewing your specific provider, they're going to narrate this to you in an organized method. That's the system narrative. And then the rest of the report, these remaining buckets, are really where they categorize their control objectives or criteria. They give us a listing of the individual controls. And then in the case of more formal reporting, you're actually going to see what steps the auditor performed step by step. And did they pass or fail? And if there was a failure, the magnitude of those issues and how that's being disclosed in the report. So if you haven't got a copy of a report, you haven't seen them before, this is really a high-level comparison of what's involved. Another distinction is for a SOC 1 or 2 report, there's also something known as a Type 1 or a Type 2 report. And these are really designed to say a Type 1 is a point in time. As of June 30th, 2022, these controls are in place. It's designed effectively. Now, that doesn't give me a lot of comfort. It says that at a single moment I walked in that environment, it appeared things were looking correct. The Type 2 report goes further and it says during this period of time, retrospectively, these controls were in place. And for myself as an end user of a provider and looking at my contractual obligations, I want to see that they're systematically not only design their controls, but they're operating them on my behalf effectively during the course of that period. And the Type 2 report, as we get into it more, you're going to see there is a test table that shows the control and the type of test that was performed and those results. Those results are very critical because it then allows me as the reader of the report to have a very good, clear understanding that, in fact, these controls met my obligations, assuming that all the controls that I would expect to see are covered. And when there's not a pass, where there's a potential exception, you'd be able to see the nature of the exception, and done properly, the report would also provide management an ability to respond back to us to disclose, do they acknowledge the issue, how they remediated the issue, what's next. So it provides a lot of transparency without myself as a customer of this provider to see what's going on, see the results, and go through and understand not only the nature of the controls in place, but how they're operating effectively. I would, kind of a lessons learned or a tip I would say is look for a type 2 report, unless it's a brand new client getting stood up for the first time, a new provider, and they have not been through a report before. Or potentially they've gone through a system conversion or some other factors that are introducing a brand new control environment for that third-party administrator, at which point it may revert back to a type 1 and then want to continue to proceed with getting a type 2. So I would always look for a type 2, 95% of the time under any given circumstance to be looking for that as a type of report. So to be clear, there's the SOC 1 and 2, which deals with transactional controls and IT controls, respectively. And then there's a point-in-time version of those reports and one that's over a period of time. So I would look for either the nature of the reports based upon the subject matter you want, and then over a period of time in the type 2 report. So why are SOC reports so important? Well, as we talked about early on, and I think Erik did a great job enumerating this, we've outsourced a portion of our business to these providers. And it's very relevant for us to want to understand what they've got going on our behalf, whether it's their system controls or IT controls or financial reporting, anything where we're not able to then ensure that we're meeting our own obligations out to the market and we've delegated those out. I want to make sure through an audit that they're meeting our expectations so we don't run into surprises in our own service delivery. There's another concept here known as a subservice provider. So there's, I may be consuming the services of a third-party administrator in the market, my primary provider. Behind them, they may have outsourced some of their services, whether it's data verification, maybe how data is being imported, mail service, maybe where they're hosting in a data center, maybe they're using a third-party cloud provider to help them. So those sub-services are actually, by extension, part of the control environment that we need to consider when we're looking at a SOC report. And these SOC reports will disclose if there is another layer of provider involved in the relationship. That would be a pointer for us to go and look more deeply. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but it's a key distinction to look at what's in play.
Yeah, I think, Chris, that's a great point. I think the one that you're going to see more frequently as well, right, which is that with record-keeping organizations increasingly outsourcing to other fintech organizations and having to bifurcate other data security elements. Once upon a time, there was one kind of monolith financial organization that you could review, and now I think ultimately these subservice organizations that Chris mentions become pretty critical partners that may not even be known by name to you if you didn't get into the detail of a SOC review.
You're exactly right. I think that's why being very astute to the nature of the reports that are involved and what we're looking for and how to obtain our confidence in our record keepers is so important. So we'll do a polling question at this point. Emily, I'll turn it over to you for a moment just to check in with folks.
All right. Let's take a look at our third polling question today. What are you most concerned about with our plan record keepers? And your options are A, completeness and accuracy of transaction processing, B, compliance with plan requirements, C, IT controls, data security, and threat protection, or D, all of the above. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts to below the slide view. We'll also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. So I'll give everyone just another moment here. Okay, let's go ahead and see what everyone had to say. Back to you.
I like the answers. So this really helped shape the next part of our conversation. The polling results showed pretty much across the board looking at interests of all areas, whether it's the transactional processing, general compliance and reporting, or IT controls. What that tells me is that in this course for today, we are going to want to talk about both SOC 1 and 2 very at length and give us a chance to get into more details. And so while we looked at the earlier slides, how the needs of reports may be similar, we'll get into more specifics about things you would look for in different areas of the reports. Great. So one of the first things I would look at is what reporting options do I have available to me as a consumer of the reports, or if I'm a record keeper, what would I want to provide out to the market? So it's always important to go back and say, if I am a business and I want to go out and understand what my vendors are doing on my behalf, first of all, it's important to understand an inventory of who are my vendors in the first place, who are my third parties that I'm working with. That allows us to then assess what's the nature of their relationship. Is it IT data related, or is it transactionally related? Does it follow certain contractual obligations? And that then, based upon identified risk, gives us an ability to say, given that associated risk, I'm going to get more, I'm going to spend more interest or concern around certain providers. And consequently, those are the ones I'm going to really roll up my sleeves to get more information. So in a very informal relationship with a third party, I may be fine just setting up a contracting and letting them do work in the background. To the other extreme, when they're taking on a lot of my business model, handling my data, processing transactions on my behalf, I want to understand that their accuracy rate, their data stewardship, their completeness and accuracy of processing matches. So I'm going to place a high level of focus on them, and that's where I am going to want to ask for a SOC 1 and or 2 report from them. And in the middle may be situations where I'm comfortable just doing more informal periodic checks with them, whether it's through a vendor questionnaire, or whether it's through inquiry, or whether just having parts of my organization perform periodic review, formal or informal sampling of their work. So that tells me which of these record keepers or providers am I most interested in. And then from there, once I do get a copy of those reports, in the case of getting a SOC report, I want to understand the results of those. So I'm going to delve in much more closely with the testing that was performed. Does that report cover the services that I've contracted with from that third-party administrator, from that record keeper? Does it enumerate what I expect? Does it cover a period of time that's of concern to me? Do the test results come back positively or negatively? So all of these things are incredibly beneficial to provide the right interpretation of the usage of the report and its applicability. So we're gonna turn our attention now. We're gonna go talk through each area of the report, cover a little more detail, what's involved, drill further for what we covered before, and then ask the question, how do I properly review the reports in the first place? So I've made a determination that this record keeper is important to me, and they are hosting their data out in the cloud on my behalf. They're hosting in the cloud. They're using a couple other providers to support the back end of the transaction processing. What does this look like for me? And by the way, they're taking in all my sensitive data in the process. So what do I look at? So we talked about earlier about the nature of the structure of the report. When I'm getting that, I would expect these reports are conforming in their presentation. And these are the areas they're going to cover. I won't read this slide to you, but you're going to start to see a pattern as we go through this. The reports follow a very similar feel. What's relevant there is what's contained in those reports, and is it applicable to me in the first place? Just because I ask for a report and maybe a provider gives it to me doesn't mean it's relevant. So what should I look for and why? And what should be of concern? The first part of the report, it would be a cover. It would say this report covers X entity, this system, and it covers this period of time or point in time as a type 1 or as a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 report. That's a big indication to me that I'm looking at transactional controls or data controls. It's the period of time or a point in time that's relevant. Is it even the system that I've contracted for? So some providers can provide sometimes 3 or 4 reports, some which may not even be things I've contracted with them for. So first thing I want to do is, does the scope match what I'm working with them on? Does the auditor's report then go through and let me see that they're operating effectively with the transactional controls they're doing, or does it really point me to some other areas of concern? So the opinion letter itself begins to get in very heavily to clarifying the scope, who's involved, if there are subservice organizations, who they are. It will tell me if there's any material issues that pop up, and will help me understand if I should be on alert as I read the report for a certain subject matter, whether certain areas that are claims processing failed, change management had an issue, there was a data breach. So be on alert on that. Even though it's a very boilerplate or very standardized language, there's some key wording in there that will be really important to pay attention to. So when I'm reviewing that report, what I want to do is, in fact, look that it matches my expectations. It aligns with my timing needs. It coincides with. So if I issue my own financial reports, and I'm looking at this record keeper, if I'm a 12/31 calendar year end, somewhere in that close proximity to my own financial audit period, I want that provider to be giving me a report that covers the majority of my period. It's current. It's not a year or 2 years old. It's aligned with the services they're providing, and I can then integrate that into my own vendor diligence or my own consideration of coverage. In the case of data and a SOC 2 report, you may have a little more latitude on the timing of what it is if it's a systematized control, but we are looking for alignment of relevancy in terms of timing and coverage of the report. I do want to see if it's pointing me towards other subservice organizations that's telling me I need to take those into account. Otherwise, I have an incomplete picture of whether there's any risk inherent in the situation with using that provider. And if there was a modified opinion, you'll usually see the word modified conclusion. And in that wording, it's going to be very clear to you, auditors calling out in one or two paragraphs where there's failures in the report and where to go look, whether page number or section content within the report. So those first couple pages are very critical just to orient ourselves to the report. From there, when we drop in more closely, what we see is there's an assertion. Here, management is effectively, the opinion letter is us as the auditor saying, here's what we've concluded. The sister document to that is the management assertion. Management saying, at this exact same point in time, we're both agreeing to you as the market. Management saying, I as the provider am telling you the same opinion was covered, the same subject matter, the same timing. I gave out the auditor all the evidence. I'm giving you representation that you should feel comfortable. And if there's subject matter that was an issue, also affirming that's okay. So this really gives you a good clarification what's in the report. So from there, what I would do is, if I was clerically reading this as a user, I would want to make sure that the content matches, and it's a complement to the overall audit report itself, or the opinion that it's saying the same period, the same time, same coverage. When we look at, now we get into the body of the report, we're getting into what's called the system description. This is a phenomenal content. It may be 10 to 20, 30 pages in length. Some reports can be much longer. This is a narrated overview. If I were to go in and interview this organization, who am I? How long have I been in business? What's the nature of my services? How do I operate my business? What policies do I have in place? How do I go through and administer all the different control areas that are covered? Defining the control areas. There's key elements here that talk about the systems that are being used to administer the business and how I've structured my control objectives and change management IT functions to cover what's going on. There's also a disclosure in here around what's called complementary user entity controls and an overview of those subservice organizations. So what this allows me to do is avoid the effort of having to send in my own team to audit the organization and spend days on site understanding them. They've really given me a very clear presentation. and myself as the auditor have also given the market assurance that this content is reliable to look at. So it's a great summary of what's in place. It gives us all a clear understanding, and it sets the backdrop before we get into any testing of what I should be concerned about, and in kind, if there's certain obligations I should be looking at more closely to prepare myself for using the audit report. So when I review this, what I want to do is I want to read it thoroughly. If I'm a user of the report, I want to understand that it meets my needs, that it is, if there's any significant disclosures going on, there was changes in the environment that are being disclosed, I should be aware of that. I need to know that there was a new IT system put in place, or we converted certain portions of our quality review of data, or how we issue checks in a different way to be adequately disclosed, so then I can consider, does that have an impact on how I'm using the services? Have I seen a disruption in service as a result of those changes? Anything I should be concerned about. And we'll get into some other sections like the complementary user entity controls, things that I actually then need to see if I'm doing myself that will give me confidence in the reporting that I'm actually doing my obligations to the report as well. So complementary user entity controls. This term may or may not be familiar to you from in the past. This term is really saying that the provider has contracted to do certain services for me, but in kind, they are saying, to complement the work I do for you, you as a user of my services, the user entity, here's controls I expect of you. You give me complete data. You confirm your contracts are set up correctly. You make sure that your wiring transactions are giving me the right account. If I have to get approval for certain functions from you, you've given me a list of who those people are. If I give you a report, you are confirming that the data you provided me is complete and accurate, that I'm working with the right information to contract with. And then in kind, if I'm giving you output from my systems, you're also confirming that it's working as expected. If it's data stewardship, and part of it is you're getting access into my systems, you are controlling limiting access to certain people. You are managing certain expectations around retention policies and following up on questions that they might arise from your users. If there's a complaint or an issue with data, you're reporting that in a timely manner so I in kind can respond. So complementary user entity controls are actually an extension of going beyond what your record keeper is doing, and they're saying, this is what I expect of you. Your auditors and you would probably want to make sure that you've actually got controls set up to meet those type of expectations. So what I would do looking at the report is I would read over those complementary user entity controls. I would see, do they make sense? Have I set up controls in my business, if those controls are applicable, that they're actually being administered? I would inform whether it's my finance department, my IT department, maybe my vendor, my procurement department, that these controls are put in place. If you are going through your own internal audit and your auditors are looking to see that you're handling these handoff spots, then you may actually need to get to the point of setting up certain test procedures, documenting those, retaining sampling evidence, retaining that and making it available to your auditors to demonstrate you're meeting those. Or if this is simply for you to make sure your business is functioning as expected, you may just want to go through the process of ensuring that these controls are in place so that your general operations don't miss a beat when you're administering. You may not need to get to a compliance question so much as procedurally I've got the right controls in place to run the business and to align with my third-party administrator. So we've set this backdrop with the overview, the narrative, and the complementary user entity controls. Now we know who the organization is, how they're operating, the type of procedures they have, and what I need to do to make this control environment work. But the heart of the report is an itemization of the control objectives, underlying controls that are being performed by the service organization, and the testing procedures that are done and the associated results of those. So what I always look at here is that we're very aware of what we expect of the service organization to perform in the first place. It's not that I just sign up and I'm done. I want to understand how are they doing contract setup? How do they go through and handle their transaction processing? How do they provide reporting? How do they ingest data? How do they confirm data that I've sent over, assuming my data is accurate? How do they adjudicate? How do they go through and handle payments and reporting? On the IT side, how do they put in other safeguards up front around change management, logical access? So all of these should be things I'm very aware of right up front around how I expect those systems to operate. And I'm going to be looking for the nature of the reporting and the tests performed and the results to see if they meet expectation. So I'm going to pause for a moment. We're going to do a sample. We're going to do a poll here real quick. And what information would you like to know more about? So this is really designed to give you a question of, how do you obtain a SOC report from your providers? How do you review reports? How do you respond to questions? And are you looking to undergo a report? So Emily, I'll turn it over to you here at this point.
All right, and this is our final polling question. So we'll give everyone some time to respond, and once you have completed all CPE requirements, you'll be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window. If you have any difficulty downloading that, just remember we will be sending it via email as well. So just a couple more seconds on this last poll here. All right, let's go ahead and see what everyone has to say. Back to you.
Perfect. So again, here the focus is really around how do I obtain a SOC report and how do I review it? So we'll spend, I think we're in the right spot here because we're going to really get out next into coverage around how the reports are being reviewed and how we go through the process of evaluating the final results of those reports. So great. When we look at the test results themselves, what we're going to be wanting to do here is, first of all, look at all the individual controls that are in place. And I would ask myself, do those controls, are they relevant? Are they applicable to what I am looking to get covered? You may have your own vendor diligence questionnaires. You may have your own contractual obligations. You may have certain predisposition of things you want to look at. I would go through the list of controls, which is in the first column of section 4 of a report, and say, are these things I'm interested in? Which of them are relevant? And when I go into the next, when I want to look at that, then I'm going to say, how did the auditor approach answering the question, did these controls work as expected? So I would wind up going through one by one and looking at the nature of the test. Did they perform an inquiry? Did an auditor gain an understanding that these controls were working as expected? Any issues? No. In order to substantiate this, did they look at the policies associated with this to see that they were actually consistent with how they said they would operate? Yes or no. Once they've done that, have they configured the system, if it's a configuration or an automated type control, to enforce this control? If it's one that's a transactional processing, did they obtain a population and samples of that to see that the control is actually being administered over the period of time as expected? And then from there, did it, in fact, produce the intended results? If there were issues or there was follow-up reporting, did they take the adequate steps to then follow up? So it's really ensuring that all elements of the controls are being met and that it's being supported in a very systematized manner. So that tells me, am I looking at the right controls, and were they actually tested in a way that I think would provide some degree of confidence? And then what are the results? No relevant exceptions noted tells me that under the sampling methods, no issues were identified. A whole clean bill of health may have 50 pages of all these tests and all clean results. However, I would also be looking for instances where there's an exception, and then being able to understand what was the nature of that exception, how did they actually respond to that exception, and management giving me feedback that they acknowledge it, they've addressed it, and I can then assess as a reader that this is a logical conclusion. It doesn't give me a lot of concern, even though there was an issue, or this causes me more issue. I'm going to want to get on the phone and talk through those findings with an audit, with the service provider, and see that, was the record keeper, did they have a breach? Did they have a failure of controls? Did they have a change in staffing that resulted in certain things not being reviewed or processed accurately during a certain window of time? Was it pervasive during the entire window of time? Or was it maybe isolated to a transitional window that's got a very specific area of focus that I should be paying attention to? So all of those tell me the universe of what could be at issue, and specifically, does that type of issue cause me concern or not? And that allows me to then drill into more detail from a diligence standpoint myself. Now, I did point out that there are subservice organizations. So we've got a full idea of what's going on with this service provider, but what about the other providers these subservice providers they've actually delegated some responsibilities to? What I would be tending to look for in the report is who are these providers in the opinion, the assertion, narrative, and then in the testing, did they get a copy of the SOC report for those providers? Did they review the results? If there was issues that might impact them, did they consider the impact? That tells me who they are, what the risk is. The next piece is really to then drill down more into what should I be concerned about for those subservice providers. So our direction for you would be then to go out and do your own evaluation of those providers. I would recommend going into asking who are the providers. Am I concerned about them? Can I get a copy of their reports? And if they don't have their own SOC report, can I go out and maybe understand who the contact is at the data center or at the outsourcing provider and get a copy of it? I'm really hoping that the third-party administrator I picked has done a good job picking a vendor that they can transparently monitor their performance. They can then steward the monitoring of it. And then they can also have available through SOC reports of their own that these subservice organizations can provide that to me as a contracted customer of this provider and allow me to do my own diligence. Because I would want to get a copy of those, open them, do the next level of detail drilling down that these providers didn't have issues. Because if they did, in any manner, whether it's their opinion, their testing, changes that went on, I would then really need to ask myself, do any of those issues cause me an issue that would not only bubble up through my own record keeper, but then do they have such a degree of risk that they put me at concern? So I may need to do my own diligence or my own supplemental testing to get confidence around that as things go forward. So be special alert. Those are really critical items to look at who those subservice organizations are. If you don't know where to look, if you get a report, they're identified roughly in the third paragraph of the opinion, right up at the very beginning of the report. They're reinforced again in the assertion, roughly the same place of that assertion letter. They're defined. There should be a section in the narrative that defines who they are, and they should also see places in the testing where they're showing how they did diligence. So there's 3 or 4 places you can identify these subservice organizations, see what critical controls are there, and give you a clear pointer of how to go in and do your own drill down as well.
Hey, Chris, before you get into the system of controls coverage, just a quick question. I mean, are there standard controls that need to be in place to give an opinion for a system of controls? Or are you solely relying as the auditor of that control system on whatever controls management you're provided by the organization? Is there any minimum that would need to be in an adequate SOC?
That's a great question, Erik. When I look at the SOC 1 report, it's really going to revolve around the nature of the transactions that I'm covering. So the scope would define, I would expect, if I'm bringing on a client, I want to make sure that their scope for the audit is actually aligned with the contracts that they're trying to administer against. So I would think for a SOC 1 on a record keeper, it wouldn't be limited to just processing checks. It would follow the life cycle of the contractual relationships we have. If it was very limited scope, I don't know if there's a lot of value in that unless there's a very specific question being asked by a very specific customer to address a technical question. So it's not prescribed what a minimum scope is for a SOC 1, but it is really relevant to understand, does it really fulfill the purpose of this contractual obligation, and does the report then mirror that? There are a few record keepers where there's one element of their life cycle that's being subserviced out to them, so they would just cover a portion of that. But I would expect it would typically cover the full life cycle of contract setup, plan management, file receipt, review, QC, adjudication, payment, all the way through to reporting and everything in between. On the IT side, I would tend to look at it covering the minimum is there. Actually, the SOC 2 does have much more prescriptive coverage around the governance of the organization, onboarding of employees, policy and communication of contractual obligations to internal and external parties, system monitoring, change management, system availability, incident management handling. And then it can be variable on the SOC 2, whether it covers confidential stewardship, privacy obligations, processing, or even if the system's up and available all the time. So it's a great question. It's kind of a nice complement to this final slide here, which really revolves around when I get these reports, again, I would go back to the basics of, does the SOC report meet my needs? Does that scope in the report, from a timing perspective, from a nature of the content of the report, the sufficient coverage of documentation, whether it's a point in time type 1 report or a period of time type 2, meet what I need? It's very easy to get a box that has XYZ company's name, and you say, I've got a SOC report. That's really insufficient. Does it align with my needs from a timing, scope, coverage standpoint? Were the testing procedures adequate that I feel that I could be relying on the results? Because unfortunately, there are a few providers out there, SOC auditors, that are very cookie cutter, and buyer beware, reader beware, that you need to make sure that the applicability and relevance of that report goes beyond just a surface level. So that's the key things I would look for. What we really wanted to do today was, in summary, was give you good coverage of, a backdrop. What does the Department of Labor and others expect of us in the market? Why are these SOC reports relevant in the first place? And giving us an opportunity to then drill down and ask the question as a consumer of these record keepers. Do I need a SOC 1 report, a SOC 2 report? What is the nature of these reports, and when should I be asking for them? It's very common, again, if you're doing the transactional processing with them and how their quality, completeness, and accuracy of data management, the SOC 1 is going to be where you want to go. If it comes down to how the data is being protected, the systems are being administered, the security around those, the threat of data breach, SOC 2 is relevant. It's very common these days in this market that SOC 1 and 2 tend to be asked for concurrent, both at the same time from our. So I wouldn't be shy, but I'd also be reasonable that if it's not a high degree of risk to you, to ask you which of these reports do I really need. The purpose of this, a lot of the second half of this session, was to really design to give you a good idea of what to look for. Maybe it doesn't answer all your questions, but gives you a good idea of what's contained in these reports, the sections of the reports, how to review them. And, if you're really looking forward to the next steps, is how do I ask a vendor for these, which comes down to, hey, provider, I've got this situation. I'm needing to do diligence on you. Can you help me get more coverage and information about what's involved? And if you don't have a SOC report, how else are you going to meet this need? Because I'm going to ask you a lot more questions, and we can cut to the chase if you've got a SOC report. and then we can get into various off-flyer questions that are more specific in my circumstances. So that's the purpose of today's session. And I know looks like we're running up against the top of the hour. I wanted to open it up. I mean, we may be out of time for verbal questions back and forth, but if you have questions, wanted to provide contact information for both myself and Erik. We can leave the screen up, give you a chance. And with that, Emily, I'll turn it over to you to close this up.
All right. Thank you, Chris. As Chris mentioned, we are just at the top of the hour, so unfortunately we don't have any time for live questions. However, please feel free to reach out directly to Chris or Erik. And for the questions that were submitted during the webcast, thank you. We'll be doing our best to follow up with you at a later point. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. And I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading that now. And here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.